Continuing on with our discussion of biogenic sediment spectra within carbonates, we've already looked at carbonate mineralogy in the previous section and saw how modern marine carbonate sediments are dominated by aragonite and magnesian calcite, while ancient carbonates are composed mostly of calcite and dolomite, in part reflecting the metastability of aragonite and magnesian calcite, which tend to convert to calcite with burial, and in part it's an indication of the evolving nature of Phanerozoic seawater, where the Palaeozoic, for example, favoured magnesian calcite and low magnesian calcite precipitates over aragonite. In this current section, we want to look at what makes up a tropical carbonate platform. In this first video chapter, we'll look at an introduction to the modern lit or photozoan light-requiring reef constructs, which are primarily a construct between scleractinian corals and coralline algae. This first discussion of the modern lit platform is made up of 6 parts, or 6 video chapters. We'll have a look at the overall nature of photozoan reefs. We'll then move on to look at how corals can build a wave-resistive framework. We'll look at how the constituent scleractinian corals texture up that framework with a view to recognizing it in the rock record. We'll have a quick discussion of Palaeozoic corals and see that the present is not an exact analogy for past coral reefs. We'll deal with this in a lot more detail in a later module where we'll look at the specific types of ancient reefs. We'll look at the coralline algae, the main modern binders, the encrusters, the biological encrusters in modern reefs. And then finally, to finish off this discussion of tropical carbonate lit platforms, we'll look at a model, the lit framework model, which can be utilised to interpret photozoan counterparts in the ancient. Let's look at what defines a modern shoal-rimmed carbonate platform, made up of shoalwater mosaics with varying proportions preserved of lit framework along with sediment and cement. The key word being lit, where we see these forms growing at water depths where light can penetrate. Let's have a quick look at how light penetrates seawater. We break up the marine realm in terms of light penetration into 3 zones. The euphotic zone, which is the uppermost zone where light can penetrate. This is sometimes called the sunlit zone or the upper photosynthetic zone. This is the zone where we have photoliths or photozoans at the base of the food chain. Below that we have the oligophotic zone. This is also known as the lower photic zone, the dusk zone. It's sometimes termed the mesophotic zone. It's the zone with lessened light penetration, but light is still penetrating. Because of that, symbiotic algae, which require light, are still active. Beyond the oligophotic zone is the aphotic zone, which is a zone where no light is penetrating. This is populated by the consumers, the heterozoans, the things that eat rather than things that utilize light to live. So we see a whole range of carbonate skeletons or exoskeletons of heterozoans flourishing in the aphotic zone. Light is controlling the types of organisms and the level of sediment that can be produced in those zones. If we look at the amount of sediment that's being produced by the euphotic biota, it's maximum in the upper 5 to 10 meters of the marine water column, shown by that red curve. Then we have the oligophotic biota, shown by the blue line, where the amount of sediment being produced maximizes out within that twilight zone. Below that, we have the aphotic biota, which live to greater depths, like the bryozoans, the mollusks, the crinoids, and the sponges. Whereas the uppermost zone, that shallow lit euphotic zone, is populated by the corals, the green algae, and perhaps the ancient reef-dwelling forms of the stromatoporoids and the rudis, which are also thought to have had symbiotic algae, so they needed light, so they lived in the euphotic zone. Perhaps at water depths a little bit deeper than modern-day corals and green algae. Given that light prevails in terms of the maximum sediment production, we can classify what's happening in the shallowest parts of a carbonate platform, the platform edge. A modern reef framework defining the edge of many carbonate platforms in the tropics is a combination of the coral framework built by the scleractinians, along with a variety of biogenic and abiogenic cements, and also many encrusters. In a modern coralgal reef, they're dominated by the coralline algae, a form of rhodophyta or red algae, along with a variety of encrusting forams. Typically, both the encrusting forams and the corals have symbiotic algae to aid in the levels of calcification. We have reef-rimmed edges and sand shoals, that both extending from the intertidal zone down to 70 metres depth, as well as the reef-rimmed edge. We can have sand shoals defining that platform edge. These are mobile carbonate sediments, typically the breakdown products of the shelly fauna, sometimes dominated by heterozoans, sometimes dominated by ooids, which characterize the shallowest part of that platform, not with a wave-resistive structure, but with a sand shoal structure, with a series of sand waves and dune forms, sometimes tidally influenced shoals, defining that edge. We'll look at the specifics of each of these as we develop this notion of what defines a tropical carbonate platform. One of the most significant observations that are made on the shelf edge is that we have wave action taking place. The action of waves does two things. It flushes over the corals, it flushes water through the corals, and so it gives them a food supply. It also supplies oxygen. And because many shelf edges are on the edges of deeper basins, we tend to see upwelling, and so as well as the oxygenation and the flushing, we see upwelling giving us greater levels of nutrient supply into that reef. Now, because reefs can form wave-resistive structures, they tend to enclose porosity and their syndepositional cements. And that's in real contrast to siliciclastic sediments undergoing wave action, where we do not see syndepositional cementation. We don't see this wave-resistive cementation that we see in carbonate reefs. And so we see very simple porosity associations in siliciclastics tied to intergranular porosity. In contrast to that, because reefs are biological structures that resist wave action, morphologies can defy gravity. They're syndepositionally bound and cemented as they form. So we can have depositional slopes in a modern reef complex where they're being bound together to form a type of rock called a boundstone, where the slopes can be as steep as 70 to 90 degrees. Cliffs. That steepness of slope is reflecting the pervasive cementation that typifies most modern coralgal reefs. The term coralgal comes from a combination of coral and coralline algae. They require lit environments, so they occur and they grow most efficiently in the photic zone with these steep inclined surfaces. Quite often, reef fronts can drop off into water depths of 100 metres or more over very narrow bands, as we see here in this image of the reef front, with the active reef formers dropping off into deep, dark blue water. In contrast, siliciclastic slopes are much simpler. The depositional slopes are controlled by the angle of gravitational stability of the unconsolidated sediment, so we don't see any slopes steeper than 30 degrees, and usually we see less than a few degrees on most siliciclastic slopes, whereas in the corals we see this quite steep cemented reef front. So corals build a framework.